Hello. Hello.
Hello, Mutiat. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Yeah. Hello. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Good. Thank you for joining us today. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. I hope you can hear me.
We can.
Okay. Thank you.
Very good. Do you want us to show your presentation or do you want to show it yourself?
You can show it for me. I think it will be easier for me. You can just show it for me. I will speak along.
Very well. Very well. We're going to show it in a second. But before that, let me just thank everyone for being with us today. It's our 5th installment of a seminar series on West African history. And Mutiat, let me introduce you very quickly, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. You are Dr. Mutiat Titilope. You work in the history department, University of Ibadan. Am I right to think that you're the only female lecturer in the department?
Yes.
Yes. So thank you for joining us tonight. We're very happy to host you. You're going to give a paper called The Second World War and Schooling in Nigeria between 1942 and 1945. I'm really looking forward to your paper, and we're going to have a session of Q&A after. So please, I think you've got half an hour, 30 minutes. Is that okay with you?
Okay, 30 minutes.
If you don't mind to just tell me when you want to go to next slide. It will be easier.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Please go. Please. You can start.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I've been introduced already. The title of my presentation is World War II and Schooling in Western Nigeria, 1942 to 1945. I started this work about 5 years ago when I was working on my postdoc at the National Archives, Ibadan. I was trying to search for petitions written by women then, when I discovered that there are several papers of the Ibadan Ministry of Education covering educational activities that occurred in Western Nigeria during the colonial era. So I was motivated to do this research because actually my first degree is in BA History and Education Combined Honors. So as a result of that, I chose to do something along education history, apart from my usual women and gender studies that I'm used to. So when I was contacted to do this presentation by IFRA, I felt that I should share my work with a scholarly audience. And so for this, I appreciate IFRA for inviting me for this presentation. So my abstract goes thus. World War II was an important event in global history that influenced social, political, and economic milieux of British colonies. With specific reference to Western Nigeria, this paper explores the paradigms of World War II in Nigeria, resources to extracurricular activities, schools in the wartime, Schools in the wartime were organized to conform and expediently shape the ideologies and methods of learning as part of the philosophies of the Win the War Fund. This paper explores how wartime activities. This work uses the historical method with primary and secondary sources. And as I said earlier on, I relied more on the papers of the Ministry of Education to discover and then facts and analyze issues as it were in the kind of correspondences between Nigeria and the colonial office in London, as well as the colonial states in Nigeria. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So actually, studies in education consider schooling in forms of expansion. Looking at the works that have been done by scholars in education history, probably in the Faculty of Education, and Professor Adeshina is trying to join, I don't know he sent a WhatsApp message to me that he's trying to join. So I don't know if you can look at it. So studies in education consider schooling in the forms of expansion, with little emphasis on how Nigerians actually partook in the social and economic activities during the wartime. So as a result of this, I tried to structure this paper along about 5 themes. First is the entanglement of colonial education policy and schooling before World War II. 2, war literature, school administration, and army recruitment, 1942 to 1945. 3, Win the War Fund and school resource management. 4, Empire Day celebration and sports. And then 5, post-World War II plans. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. Now, this picture and the one in the slide after it is actually a kind of advertising how Nigerians win the war fund during the World War era. And so if you look at the image as it is captioned here, your granules help to feed fighting forces. Thank you, Nigeria. Your granules help to feed fighting forces. Thank you, Nigeria. That is, and the next slide shows how Nigerians were actually of value in ensuring that British victory in the war was guaranteed. Next slide. Now, this paper posits that there is a deviation that the schools were subjected to in the form of skills acquisition during the war. But after, the idea of training for skills was jettisoned, which was a precursor to deindustrialization. So my argument here is the fact that specifically that period, 1942 to 1945, schools were made to be extremely functional, and the functions of vocational educational practice were well instilled in the schooling system, but it was for a purpose. Afterwards, the dimension of schooling in Western Nigeria changed, and so I will discuss that in other slides. Please move on. Next slide.
Excuse me, Oladejo, it's quite difficult to hear you quite a lot. So probably if you shut off your camera, you may have a better sound, a better voice for us.
Okay, let me do that. Okay. Okay, so specifically on November 24, 1942, the manager of Ijualadura School in Ibadan wrote to the senior education officer requesting for war news magazines sent out weekly to teachers in the colonial civil service. This request signifies the kind of passion and loyalty teachers in the colonies displayed towards the colonial cause, and specifically the support for Britain's victory during World War II. And we all knew that there are two factions during the World War, the Axis and the Allies, and Britain belonged to the latter. And of these, the Axis had upper hand and a kind of early victory at the initial stages of the World War. But subsequently, by 1942, the Allies had more advantage. And I sense that this advantage was due to the fact that Britain was able to mobilize around its colonies for support to win the war. Next slide. So in the context of the Win the War Fund initiated in Nigeria, the colonies keyed into the process, and keying into the process featured situations by which school culture were entangled, and it became an avenue for colonial advocacy, fundraising, child labor, and army recruitment. Next slide, please. Of course, scholarly works from the perspective of Nigeria, examining their roles in the World War II is a a little more, there is more focus on the other side on how the World War II occurred in the global space. But specifically in Nigeria, scholars such as Chimakore recently published a book, Nigeria and World War II, Colonialism, Empire, and Global Conflict. From this book, reading it, I was able to garner the fact that he was trying to put forth how Nigerians actually contributed to the war. And so he came up with the fact that some of the involvement of Nigerians were either reactionary or supportive. But in this case, I'm trying to see how supportive Nigerians were in the Win the War Fund process. Next slide. So the philosophies guiding this involvement of school children, especially during the war, according to some scholars such as Omolewa, showed that songs, for example, were used to kind of articulate and garner support from the schools. For instance, a chant goes thus, I read, Hitler, a scatterbrain who never had an issue and thus does not appreciate the value of children. He has no compassion, no virtuous God, the creator of the universe, thoughts. Please strike Hitler dead, that he may stop his machination. This alone in itself was to create a kind of awareness and sensitization among children in schools in Western Nigeria. Furthermore, next slide, in Eastern Nigeria, next slide, please. In Eastern Nigeria, I make a kind of reference to that, even though I'm not studying Eastern Nigeria, but it's just a kind of reference. Part of the way to destabilize German culture in Nigeria among school children in Eastern Nigeria was also prominent in this chant. Piam, piam, piam. We crack the kernels so that we can get more to sell. We crack them all the time, we crack them till our bags are full, just to help the allied nations win the war. Piam, piam, piam. So the setting of this song was among school children, and it's just about creating a kind of aggression against the Germans. Next slide, please. So education policy and schooling before World War II, of course, singling out 1942 to 1945 alone doesn't mean that there are no policies before World War. Of course, the policies before in the 19th century and the early 20th century was basically about making Africans be able to read and write so that they can serve as clerks in the colonial civil service. But of course, with Lord Lugart's emergence and with the policy of indirect rule, it became important to introduce a kind of adapted education. This adapted education was to support the policy of indirect rule. So of course, there were several conferences, such as the ASNETA conference in 1923 and some other conferences. Next slide, please. And some other conferences, but eventually what is most important that we can glean from those conferences is the fact that the British was trying to adopt the American style of education in the indirect rule system. And the purpose was just to ensure that less cost was incurred in the management of education, even though education had been operational with the missionaries since the 19th century. Next slide. So the spend less cost policy took different dimensions during the colonial era. The dimension that unfolded during World War II gives the deeper insight into the way schools were mainstreamed into the relations of production. Next slide. So the nature of schooling was actually an agglomeration of various factors that accumulated from the mid-19th century, of course, informed by the legacies of the French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, and the movement for socio-economic reforms. And a number of these issues were factored in the Imperial Education Conferences, some of which I had mentioned earlier. Next slide. So for this, the summary from all these conferences makes me to come up with the fact that in spite of the colonial education plans in British Africa, during the interwar years, World War II disrupted the plans as the motives of schooling was tampered with for social and economic reasons. So that's the reason that justifies why I had to pick 1942 to 1945 for this study. Next slide. According to Adu Boahen, Europeans were really interested in educating Africans because of the perceived disruption it could mean in the metropole-periphery relations. While the colonial governments really established schools, the process that led to the establishment of the few were cumbersome. So, despite the low availability of schools at the inception of World War II, the colonial states in Nigeria utilized the schools for wartime resources, as wartime resources. Next slide. So, to an extent, under the theme War Literature, School Administration, and Army Recruitment, distribution of war texts to the colonies was a common phenomenon in the wartime. And it was actually meant to ensure that the teachers were well sensitized and aware of what their roles should be and how they should be interested. Before 1943, teachers in missionary schools left the teaching services. However, the terms of recruitment by which the teachers are wanted in the army was to preserve their duties under the Nigeria Defense Regulation of 1942. So to an extent, the recruitment process was a problem because teachers became inadequate to manage the schools itself. As school managers of CML schools complained that 2/3 of them left to join the army. So in spite of those shortages, the Chief Secretary of State, Hoskins Abraham, affirmatively informed the Director of Education Lagos that the military needs more recruits as tradesmen. And so as a result of that, it claimed that the military have recently represented that they are unable to obtain anything like sufficient recruits suitable for enlistment as learner tradesmen. They require 1,000 recruits a month, all of whom must be able to speak English, and 20% of whom must have Class 2 certificates. In December 1942, they obtained less than half of this number. Next slide, please. Next slide. So it was obvious that the colonials, it was obvious that the colonial state was less concerned about genuine education for Africans, but rather the kind of that suits their economic and political objectives. So by January 1943, the education officer in Ibadan was mandated to enlighten Nigerian pupils, not even only the teachers, but also the pupils, to join the army. In the recruitment were incentives such as allowances, leaves, clothes, hours of work, and duties. And these were part of the things were actually used to sensitize both the teachers and pupils at that point in time. Next slide. Next slide. So African teachers were particularly interested to broaden their knowledge base in a newly found modern society. So these were part of the factors that actually drew the teachers away, even from the schools. The teachers used the text to understand the essence of teaching in the schools and values inculcated. So, as I used in the introduction, the manager of Ijoala School in Ibadan wrote to the senior.
Can you, Phoenix Smart, can you close your microphone, please? Who is in Phoenix Smart? Thank you.
So, as I said earlier in the introduction, the manager of Ijoala School in Ibadan wrote to the senior education officer, and parts of the extracts from the letter shows that he says, "I ask you humbly to please enlist my name with those school managers who receive from you the war news, which is being sent out weekly. The world news entitled Nigeria Review, I shall be very grateful to you for this forever. So this shows the experience of how even teachers were interested in supporting in the Win the War fund process. Next slide. Next slide, please. So for schools in Oyo, Ijebu, Abeokuta, and Ilesha, it was mandated that a war corner should be established in the schools where copies of texts and pictures of maps were hanged as learning resources. For instance, maps of Mediterranean and North Africa, Russian fronts, and Far East were given to the schools. The maps were used to teach the directions of war movements and its significance to Britain's victory. The intention of sensitizing Africans on the war really seemed as a display of good governance, but it was clear that the interest of the British in international politics was the main target. Next slide, please. Next slide. In addition, pupils and students were afforded the opportunity to learn war strategies by staging films to serve as a propaganda. For example, a cinema was shown at Rex Cinema on Wednesday, February 17, 1943, to actually stage films that encourages support for, especially to sensitize teachers and people interested in joining the army. Next slide. Furthermore, standard 6 pupils were deemed qualified to enroll as learner clerk in the army. Primary school learners were very enlisted, and as at August 1943, 55 of such were given the privilege and even marriage allowance. So indirectly, mission schools that had produced teachers realized that their graduates were less interested in teaching, but to join the army. So that was how, in various towns in Western Nigeria, the war recruitment and the schools were entangled for teachers and pupils all together. Next slide. Of course, it became obvious that the school allowance given to the teachers was also a factor in hindering interest in teaching. So mobilizing the public in Ibadan, for example, and other towns, military display of army tradesmen was targeted at working out means to collect donations for ex-teachers and pupils to service their needs. So beyond the fact that in the schools, teachers and pupils were recruited, even to the public in Ibadan, for instance, the kings, the chiefs, they were also mobilized in such a way that they raised funds. And I remember one of the materials I read at the archives, where in Ibadan, for example, at the race course, there was constant process of raising funds to support the war. Next slide. So furthermore, in a propaganda leaflet circulated to West Africa, the illustration depicts Germans as brutal and violent people who could rob West Africans of their produce, like I showed in the image and the caption earlier on. Apart from the fact that Nigerian schools were used as sources of recruiting human capital, they were also sources of managing human capital even within the school space. For instance, the leaflet titled "Victory is Vital" was used to sensitize reasons why they should ensure that produce exchange was managed in such a way that it favored the British colonial economy. For instance, in one of the illustrations and quotes in the leaflet says, "You are honestly paid in money for the produce you sell. If you like, you can save for some of your money in the post office savings bank. The post office pays you to save for your own future. With the money you receive, you can buy clothes for yourself and your children, kerosene to give you light at night, food, bicycle, sewing machine, or anything else you like from the store. When Britain has defeated Germany, more ships will be set free to carry your produce to many countries, and your trade will improve. in spite of the war, the British government is paying you a fair price for your produce. Next slide. The words in the leaflet indicated economic benefits useful within the colonies. And then the demand for agricultural processing from schools might defy the practices of mobilizing students for post-harvest production. The church schools, for example, were used as spaces for post-harvest production. And even before then, the missionaries had established farm and demonstration centers in the school. So this initiative from the missionaries were also used in ensuring a kind of farm school network where the curriculum was changed to reorient African pupils to engage in post-harvest production for packaging for exports. Next slide. So involved in this production system was the United African Company, because a number of schools were attached to the United African Company to manage the exportation of produce. And in the curriculum system, what it meant was that practical work, the scheme of cracking palm nuts was set in such a way that 5% accrued to the school as a prize-giving strategy. So in order to motivate processing, a prize-giving strategy was introduced: school cracking the most kernels per scholar. School cracking the most kernels per scholar. So it became a form of competition to motivate the schools to process more for exports. Next slide. So beyond the community and beyond the school itself, the colonial agricultural departments, the colonial education department, they were also involved in the coordination of activities, even including the Nigerian Union of Teachers. And so what this implied was that child labor was important in the human capital relations during this era. And though it became an emergency form of introducing vocational education and practice, such that students also do social work, and Boy Scouts and other schooling activities were attached to this. Next slide. Then, another thing is Empire Day celebration and school sports. Of course, from the beginning of the war till 1944 precisely, the Empire Day was used to introduce school sporting activities, and it was also attached to the Win the War campaign, in the sense that speeches on the message on the day were used to sensitize the students on the reason that while they have to maintain fitness and efficiency, while they tackle the enemy nations. So the idea of enemy nations was prominent in the speeches of the Empire Day celebration. And the sporting activities introduced during this era also meant that they also tried to use the next slide, please. Use the environment as environmental objects, such as lime, coconut, sand, wood, and so on, were used to manage the sporting events. And in one way or the other, by 1945, the learning process, the dimension of calling the Axis enemy nations changed, because it was obvious that Britain had attained victory in the war. Next slide. So while the empire, by 1945, while the Empire Day message changed to the fact that Nigerian children should be aware of a future for Nigeria, irrespective of their ethnic affiliation, of course, also showed that fact that even as at that time, ethnicity was a factor considered in the colonial relations with Nigeria at that point in time. So emphasis was placed on a kind of Nigeria for a unity in diversity. And subsequently, after post-World War II, at the end of the war, the victory message says, to all of you, I send congratulations to to all on the occasion of victory, and warmest thanks of His Majesty's government and of the great people of Britain for the loyal and generous part that all the varied communities of the British colonial empire have played in achieving it. Your contribution has been a noble and valuable one, and has shown itself in many and varied forms: in service in the armed forces and merchant navy, and in civil defense, in helping to produce vital materials for war, in the maintenance of essential services on your lands, in gifts of loan and money you have made for the furtherance of the war, and voluntary welfare work and hospitality for His Majesty's forces. Next slide. So subsequently, what this meant for schooling in Western Nigeria was the fact that there were several, it was also the period of internal self-rule, and there were several agitations for a kind of education that meant that all education should be available for all and sundry, but it became gradually and less vocational because schooling was mainly for prosperity. And it was at that point in time that in Western Nigeria, for example, the idea of free education was beginning to build up. And so less emphasis was placed on vocational education, rather much emphasis on the fact that everybody should be enrolled in school and education should be available for all in the spirit of nationalism. Next slide. So, of course, some of the nationalists, I was able to find out how they were involved and how they took advantage of the education system at this time. Prominent nationalists that we used to know of were Mr. Ajasin. They were called Mr. then, Mr. Ajasin and Mr. Alayande of Western Nigeria, and then their registration number with the schools they attended and how they took advantages of the scholarships and network of education in the colonies at that time, I stated here. So ultimately, education was about the declarations of the United Nations Organization, and it was masterminded under the developmental trajectory that took place after 1945 as part of the decolonization process for the colonies. Next slide. So conclusion, I come up with the fact that schools were an extension of the Win the War fund strategies in Western Nigeria. On the other hand, such strategy promoted the African vocational education system, profound in the pre-colonial era. But that period, 1942 to 1945, was a kind of emergency situation where vocational education was instilled back into the schools. But we all knew that such emergency was based on the fact that schools were to be productive mechanisms to enhance profits by the school itself, the community, and the colonial departments. Nigeria's involvement in the victories of the Allied powers created new paradigms to imperial expansion. The British ensured that the schools in Nigeria fulfilled the course of adapted education, as I mentioned earlier, and were mainstream to adopt an economic culture of support within the local setting. Schooling was annexed to World War II in a demand-supply-driven manner, where labor and human capital utilization was of essence. Nigerian nationalist agitation for favorable educational plans was reinforced by the fact that the Allied powers claimed in the Atlantic Charter that they would respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they live. But of course, my conclusion is that ultimately from that era that free education was introduced and all that, the idea of functional or vocational education was de-emphasized. So thank you very much for listening. I'll be happy to listen to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Well done. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Well done. I want to thank you. Thank you, Mutiat. Sorry. Thank you for keeping the time first. You know, it's exactly 30 minutes. So well done. I really enjoy your paper. You know, I'm, as you know, I've worked on northern Nigeria and education in northeastern Nigeria. So I've got to a very interesting part of the story here, which I maybe didn't know anything much about. So thanks a lot for that. I'm sure I do have lots of questions, but I'm sure I can go and meet you to ask the questions directly. Let me ask our colleagues who are online who came here to talk to you, to listen to you first and to talk to you. Let me ask everyone if they have short comments and maybe big questions, in that order, okay? So try to keep your comments short and try to ask questions if you can. Thank you. So who would like to ask a question first? Can you please raise your hand? I can see Mr. Wazir. Mr. Wazir, please.
Yeah, my name is Wazir. I'm also a Nigerian with my PhD in view. So I'm interested in Nigerian history, of course, and as it relates to education. So the first question that came to my mind is, so because I missed a part of the, when you spoke about the schooling system, do you look at formal education basically, or do you look at other form of schooling like the Arabic school that they have? They call them Ileke or something like that. Are those involved in part of the discussion?
Should we take 3 questions in a row? Is that okay? Thank you, Mr. Wazir. Someone else, please. There were comments in the chat from Hassoum, who spoke last week, who said you could find the economic benefits of education highlighting newspaper ads. Yes. The title of the year for Prof. Adeshina, who said How Missionaries Underdeveloped Africa. So Prof. Adeshina, thank you. That's the title of the year. Now we should write the book. Mr. Kabiru Amusa, please.
I'm trying to, okay.
Kabiru Amusa, please.
Oh, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, that was a very wonderful research from Prof. Ma. Well done, Ma.
Okay.
There is an aspect of your presentation that actually struck me, and that has to do with the intention of the colonial masters as regards the policy on education. And it wasn't surprising that the basic agenda, or let me say the hidden agenda, beyond what we could even lay our hands upon, are tilted towards international imperialism, or let me say international capitalism. So with what the system is all about, I don't know, is it possible for the attention given to the school also subdivided to the military? Because I really want to know, aside the fact that schools were used to like help sensitize the people against the war, what other aspects were the military used? Is it that they were just fit for the war, or they were just used as machinery for the war? Was there no way they actually contribute, or let me say contributed to the prior knowledge of what the people are supposed to know as regards the war? And again, from the conclusion, it shows that the British colonial masters, or let me say the colonialists, understood the contribution of Nigerians, like other nations which have took part in the war, for them to have sent a message thanking them, appreciating their efforts. So it shows that they actually realized that without them, it's possible for them to have been defeated. So does it mean that the extension of this appreciation goes beyond the letters? Was there any other benefits? Because, you made mention of giving them the excuses of getting a proper channel towards their resource management, because it was as if they negotiated their resource rights to freedom if they overcome the war. From from findings, are those promises fulfilled? I don't know if you really understand what I'm asking, man.
Okay, can you summarize your question?
I try to understand.
What's your question in a nutshell, please?
Okay. Oh, yeah, I'm asking two questions now. The first one is...
I think I get him.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. All right.
I think I can get him, yeah.
Please, Mutiat, answer if you don't mind answering, please.
All right, no problem. Thank you.
Okay. So the first question from Wazir says, well, what kind of education is this work capturing? Actually, it's capturing the formal education system, and it's not making reference to the Arabic education system, because at that point in time, Arabic education was strictly non-formal, and it was not factored in when it comes to issues of what defines education at that point in time. It was actually when scholars like Fafunwa or Shokoya and the likes began to define and conceptualize education that we began to realize that Arabic education was actually a form of education that had existed even before colonialism. So the focus of this paper is basically about the formal education that is embedded in the education that came from the West. So that is that. I'll try and Kabir's question is in about three forms. Well, it's not the school and like I said earlier on, the school and the army, they are extensions of each other during this period. It's difficult to, the way the education system was structured in those 3 years, it's quite difficult to say that there is something different about the army and something different about the school. There was a kind of interconnection and everything is intertwined together. So that's it about how the military and the schooling system was at that point in time. So was there anyone that contributed to a kind of, well, for the second question, I don't quite get it well, but of course, through staging films, through sending colonial officers to actually sensitize, this was a way by which the community, for example, they were sensitized and given a kind of awareness about the importance of joining the military. So I guess that's what you are trying to say in your second question. And things, World News magazines and all that were used. Even in schools, work corners were established in the libraries as libraries for schools. And it was even from those work corners that the libraries of Western Nigeria education system evolved from subsequently by the 1950s. So the third question from Kabir says, of course, that letter, there is more to that letter. There's no doubt about the fact that there is more to that letter, because it meant that Britain is appreciating the fact that on the part of Nigerians, they had fulfilled the promise. And much as they weren't, from that letter, if you look at it critically, they weren't promising Nigerians anything. They were even identifying the problems they knew that was with Nigeria before that time, because they identified ethnicity as a factor, and that they believed that Nigeria should be unified in diversity. So that is it. There, of course, there is more to that letter, and it gives room for further research to actually see the kind of relationships that and the kind of promises that made Africans put so much effort to win the war, and subsequently, and what did they get in return after 1945. So thank you.
Chats. Do you mind, if you don't mind, I'll read them to you. The first one is from Hassoum, our colleague from the Gambia, who talked last week. So thank you, Hassoum, for your question. I think it's quite a more factual question, but do you have any idea as to how much of colonial budgets went to education during those years, you know, or even during the whole war? So, you know, is there a proportion of the colonial budget you could tell us, you know, which went into education? That's the first question from Hassoum. And the second question from Guzi Ideagu, thank you. It's a quite specific question as well. You might be a factual as well. To what extent did the government college Ibadan, so it's a colonial government school, feature in your research on the exploitation of secondary students for war purposes?
What extent, please? I didn't get it.
To what extent does the Government College Ibadan feature in your own research, basically? Is the Government College Ibadan in it or not, basically? So first one, proportion of colonial budgets which went into education. Second one is about Government College Ibadan.
Okay, yeah. Actually, I like these questions because this is the reason why I put up this topic for presentation, because I actually want to see people's views and then other dimensions to enrich this work. And so I am going to research further about what the colonial budget says to education at that time. And if that's an aspect I've not even thought of initially. And to what extent is GC? Actually, there are several schools in Western Nigeria at that point in time. And etc. I'm trying to look at the history of GCI in itself. But I think with this, I will make more effort to see what has been written about the history of GCI, to actually see how I can integrate that into this study, because these were one of the foremost schools that had been existing in Ibadan since the 20th century. Yeah, thank you.
And any ideas on the budget, on the proportion of the budget spent on education in those years?
Yeah, I'm going to do more research on that. I'm going to do more research on that, yeah.
No worries, no worries. We've got someone from Ghana, who studied the similar theme in Ghana, Angba Victor. He wrote a paper on a similar subject, so maybe you can talk to each other after, so maybe. But should we go back to two more questions, two more live questions, and after that, two more chat questions. There's one called Sheyi, am I right? Someone called Sheyi. Do you have a question, please? Obafemi, sorry. Mr.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I really appreciate IFRA for bringing Ms. Mutiat for this research, for this presentation. It really enriches my knowledge. But I have a question. I'm asking this question based on my perspective from political science department, University of Ibadan, postgraduate, masters. So my question goes thus: among political scientists, we often have this idea that the participation of Africans in the World War was one of the reasons why, when they came back, those people that fought during the war, when they came back, they now started fighting agitations for nationalism. There was an increase in nationalist agitation after the war because Africans who participated in the war, while we are these colonial masters, they are just human beings just like us. So I just want to ask, is there a link between the fact that Africans went for this war and assisted the colonial masters to win this war, and the thought of free education post-war, after the war? Was there a link between that? Do you have a link between
colonial masters?
Hello, do you get it?
Yeah, you said, is there a link between colonial masters?
A link between the fact that Africans participated in the war, post-war, when they now came back, they have their mentality to demystify that the colonial masters are just human beings with flesh and blood, just like us. So when they came back, was there a link between the fact that they went for the war, fought alongside with these colonial masters, and the urge for nationalist movement for free education when they came back?
Okay, yeah, I get you.
Thank you, Mr. Shi. Mr. Matthew Ayodele, please, you had a question, please.
All right, thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you, Doctor, for that expository presentation. Really benefited a lot from. My question is coming from the perspective of curriculum development, the colonial educational curriculum development. I just want to see if we can justify preparation for the Second World War through educational, policy from the perspective of, the colonial education or the missionaries' education, the curriculum, like the geography curriculum and history curriculum, being focused on the European culture, the geography curriculum being focused on, the Alps, European mountains, all these things. Can we actually say this curriculum was actually structured or tilted towards preparing, Africans or indigenous people in understanding, all right, the European, geography, their history, in order to give them this mental awareness that they really have to be loyal to them, or to give them the knowledge of their terrain, so that they will recruit them into their military military regiment or something, in order to take them along for the Second World War precisely.
Okay, I get you. Thank you.
Can you try to answer both questions, please, Mutiat?
Okay. Yeah, the first question says just a kind of summary that Africans participated in the war and probably coming back, they became nationalists. Yeah, I had a course to research on a biography of an ex-serviceman in Ibadan here. And some of the readings I've done while trying to work on that biography, I realized that actually ex-servicemen, they were not really nationalist agitations, because they felt they had seen some levels of modernization different from their local setting, and their idea was actually to project that British culture on the local setting. And so what they were trying to do at that point in time was to influence the local chiefs to start thinking English, to start thinking British, actually. It wasn't as if they partook in the decolonization or nationalist process. It was the likes of Awolowo and Azikiwe that were doing that. But for the ex-servicemen, they were more interested in the sophistication of the British culture, and they were interested in projecting that in the local setting. So as a result of that, the society valued them so much, especially in the traditional political system, to the extent that they were given chieftaincy positions. So that was the kind of trend at that point in time. They were not really nationalists. So the fact that they partook even the First and Second World War doesn't mean that they were interested in that internal self-rule or independence. No, that was not their interest. Their interest was to a kind of attain a status within the local setting and entrench the British culture. And so the Matthew's question, yeah, curriculum development, it was very obvious that that's bringing in world news, books, magazines, and all that, creating a war corner and developing a library for the schools actually went a long way in influencing the kind of curriculum, even post-1945. And that was why a number of histories, for instance, in geography and history curriculum, there are more of teaching European history, European geography and all that. So this was part of the knowledge decolonization process that even early historians had to contend with at that point in time. And of course, you are conversant with the stories of how Kennedy and J.F. Adiajayi contributed to decolonizing knowledge at that point in time, away from teaching strictly European history and focusing on African history. So of course, in the process of curriculum development, those features of establishing libraries, bringing in books, contributed in no small way to ensure that the curriculum in Nigeria, even to the higher education level after 1945, was about teaching European history before African historians came up with the idea of designing curriculum for African history. So that's that. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting curriculum as well. Thank you. Doctor, we have a question from Prof. Adeshina. It's in the chat. Do you want me to read it? Or do you
Yeah, please read it.
It's a quite specific question. Did the nut cracking process in the schools speak to the export valorization process of the colonial administration, or was it a totally separate policy?
The nut cracking process.
Yes. Did it speak to the export valorization process? Was there a link basically between what was happening physically in schools and what the British were trying to do in terms of exportations, I suppose?
Yeah, definitely. That's what I have explained, narrated in the presentation, that that process was a kind of cooperation between the school, the colonial commerce department, education department, and even the agricultural department, as well as the United African Company, because they introduced scholarship, mini scholarship in such a way that as much as a school can do post-harvest production processing of cash crops, as much as they will get funds to manage the schools, even for the pupils themselves, in as much as it was a process of human capital development. Well, it can be debated, it could be positive, it could be negative, but of course it was obvious that child labor was used through the school system to ensure that production process went on smoothly and efficiently in the wartime.
The European war effort was clearly based on that child labor as well. Thank you for your answer. We've got a comment by our colleague Jean-Luc Martineau based in France. I think he's got figures he might be able to talk about with you. Jean-Luc, are you with us now? Do you want to talk about it for 2 minutes?
Yes, I am with you. Actually, I wanted to insist on the fact that there is not such a big increase in the financement of schools, missionary schools, voluntary agency, as it was said, and before and during the war. The increase of the finance is not so much that it can really show an investment of the government. I have a feeling that most of the investment was more in speech, as usual for colonial authorities, in fact. And the real break in the policy of the British was really after the war, when you had the 10-year plan. Up to the end of the war, you have a slightly yearly increase of students in schools, of primary schools finance, but not really a strong break that would show a real policy towards the schools as an investment for the war. I have the feeling, listening to you and looking at the feature I have, all the features I collect were collected from the Oyo Ministry of Education, where I worked. All these features were more about a long-term increase, and not a strong policy involvement. This is what I can say. I don't know if you have maybe you found speeches or qualitative information that would contradict my views, but in that case, where did you get them?
So, Mutiat, there's a question about the figures you found.
I appreciate your okay, I should go on.
Yeah.
Okay, I appreciate your intervention, but beyond the figures, it is very obvious. My study is about the actions and roles Nigerians played in the Win the War Fund process. Now, going into the financial aspect, there could be arguments as to there wasn't much, and then there wasn't more difference, that most of these things were in speeches. Much as we could say that there were speeches, no doubt, but the realities are there for us to see. Because when you talk about curriculum development, it was obvious that there was a kind of curriculum imposition. And when you talk about, and we cannot remove the fact that children were used as child labor, whether it's now yielded the kind of profits or increase per se in financial terms may be a different thing entirely. But what is most important was the fact that this event, 1942 to 1945, took place, and schools were spaces for child labor recruitment in the production process, teacher recruitment into the army, and of course, civic education also came in terms of physical and health education. And so invariably, we could say that that period also mattered, like a student said earlier on, because some of the things that occurred at that point in time, 1942 to 1945, shaped the kind of curriculum we had even post 1945. And I can even say that in contemporary times, we still have those traces of things that happened then. They are still the way they are, even in schools in the post-colonial era. So thank you for the intervention.
Got a question from our colleague who worked in Ghana. Actually, it's a general question, but it's from Victor Angba. The question is, how did the colonial government use education during the post-war period, so that's after the war, in order to deflate socioeconomic tensions Have you studied the post-war period, Mutiat, or not yet? Maybe one day.
Yeah. Of course, I have some other works that focuses on the post-war period. For instance, in the publishing industry, for example, just like I said earlier on, even in the post-war period, despite the fact that the nationalists were agitating for internal self-rule and decolonization, from correspondences I have read, I realized that multinational publishing firms, it was post-1945 era that they actually started using local bookshops and local businessmen to actually bring in books that were not factoring in the kind of our indigenous knowledge and culture. So all the books we read, and even some of the rhymes we sang in our nursery school days, it was from these books that those rhymes were derived from. So as post-1945, it was just an avenue to renew the kind of relationships. I called it renewal because we realized that publishing industries, local publishing industries could not thrive. And apart from the fact that the local publishing industries could not thrive, apart from the fact that local publishing industries couldn't thrive, African authors such as, for instance, Saburi Biobaku, one of the foremost historians, wrote a book at that point in time that the multinational publishers rejected. They rejected it because it's a kind of African content coming from an African. And so it was these foreign books brought into Africa that were enlisted in the curriculum for children to use in schools. So those were the kind of, so invariably, it still boils down to the fact that nationalization agitations, nationalist agitations, decolonization process were mainly political. But when it comes to the content of the curriculum, it took a lot of time before we could actually decolonize, and we are still decolonizing even to contemporary times. Thank you.
Thank you, Mutiat. Any last questions for Dr. Oladejo, who must be very tired now after 1 hour of talking? Maybe one last question? Mr. Wazir, yeah, sorry, please go for it, Mr. Wazir.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the topic because it's what I'm looking into. So I have other questions that might not be direct. So, but if you have insight into them, I'll really appreciate them. So the first question is there a documentation or is there any text that has discussed the monetary value of what Nigeria contributed to the British cause during the First World War and the Second World War? And also looking at global history at that time as well, would you think there's a big difference between the idea that the British government, the colonial government, wanted to divert all resources to the workforce in Nigeria, because they did, was there a difference between what they did in Britain as well? Because in Britain as well, they did the same. And even across the world, in some other places, in India, they did the worst because there was famine in India. We had a diverted food that was meant for some people to the war effort, and it led to starvation and all that. So I don't know if in the case of Nigeria, is there another issue with, is there a similar issue with starvation and all that, and that is similar to what happened in India?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think I don't specialize in economic history, but from the things I know that really, I can't really say there was famine and starvation in Western Nigeria at that point in time. Rather, there was just diversification from producing for subsistence or producing food crops into producing cash crops. And I think in another research about food dynamics and gender, I realized that there was also a gender dimension to this because women were largely involved in producing food crops at that time, while men diverted to producing cash crops. So there was a kind of gender dimension in that. And because probably the society is largely patriarchal and the men have access to the resources and control of the resources, so it was easier for men to shift to cash crop production while women remained in the process of producing food for subsistence. So really, I can't say there was famine or starvation in Nigeria or like other places, but to a certain extent, there was a kind of diversion. Then you said something about documentation on monetary value. Yeah, I told you earlier on, these are things I'm also going to be looking at to see what the monetary and financial aspects of this implies for these findings. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oladejo. I think it was our last question, but let me thank you in the name of IFRA, of course, for being with us today. You know, I think I've got a lot of questions. For example, we talked about gender differences. It's something I've seen in northern Nigeria in education a lot. So I think we can discuss together later. But let me thank everyone who's here, all the audience, of course, for being here today. Let me remind you that all our seminars are recorded online and should be available on IFRA's website by the end of this month. Thanks to the work of my colleague just next to me, this is Juliette Rufflet. So thank you, and thank you, Juliette. Let me remind you, the next week should be our last seminar with this last installment of the seminar. So for this session, we're supposed to have this speaker a few weeks ago. I'm talking about Dawzara, but we couldn't make it because of technical difficulties. Now, this last paper will be given in French at the same time, am I right? 5 p.m. Nigerian time. And it's going to be about food crisis in Burkina Faso. So I hope you can make it. And thank you, all of you, for being here today. And you've got Dr. Oladejo's email in the chat. But if you can't find it, email me. I'll be happy to give it to you as well. Okay, so thank you and have a good night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mutiat. Thank you.
Yeah. You register your name. Soon I